Behavioral economics is a study that looks at the question that standard economics looks at, but without assuming that people are rational. So we look at the decisions we make day in and day out about shopping and buying and investing and healthcare and so on, but without assuming people are rational and asking instead how people actually behave and whether the way they behave are good for them or bad for them. It turns out that the reality we see is a mixture of what's out there, but also what we expect. And if we expect to see something in a certain way, it will often conform to our expectations. For example, if I gave you two beers, one with balsamic vinegar, one without, and didn't tell you anything about it, you will actually enjoy the one with balsamic vinegar more. But if I told you that one had balsamic vinegar, no matter how much you drank of it, you will expect it to be disgusting, and you know what? It actually will be disgusting. So if we go to buy a moisturizer and we decide to splurge and buy one for $60, we might think it's only for one time. We might think we're just trying it for once. But in fact, when we come next time, we're not going to evaluate the decision from scratch. We're going to think about what we've done before, and we're likely to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, creating actually a stream of buying moisturizer for $60. We will take into account our previous decision and are likely to make the same decision over and over and over. One of the problems with free is that it's so alluring that we might end up waiting in line for a long, long time, sacrificing a lot of our time, even when we do it to get something we don't really want, just because we can get it for free. So it turns out that it's very hard for us to evaluate things in an absolute way. So what do we do instead? We evaluate them in relative terms. We compare something to other things that are around it. So for example, if we take a certain amount of food and it's on a small plate, it might look to us like a lot of food. But if we take the same amount of food and we move it to a much bigger plate, all of a sudden it would look much smaller, and in fact it would feel as less food. Dishonesty and cheating are interesting, fascinating topic. And it turns out that it's not just about how we cheat other people. It's also how we cheat and rationalize our own behavior in our own eyes. And the two most interesting findings we have in this is first, that it turns out that a lot of people cheat, but they cheat just a little bit. We find it much easier to cheat, and we get away with it, we rationalize it, and we end up not thinking of ourselves as being cheaters. The second thing is that when we deal with things that are not money, they could be other things. They could be tokens, they could be balls, they could be pencils. We find it much easier to cheat. So it turns out that people feel comfortable with themselves taking office supplies from the office home. They don't think of themselves as bad people. But if you ask the same individuals whether they would take 10 cents from a petty cash box when there's no chance that anybody would ever find out about it, they will say, of course not. And the interesting thing is, what is it about the fact that when something is not cash, when it's office supplies or other things, we feel so comfortable stealing it? In terms of price, we often get what we expect. So if you go to a pharmacy and you look at two bottles of cold medications, one is a full price, one is a half price. You turn them around and the ingredients are identical. So you go for the cheap one, you go for the discounted one. But guess what? Unconsciously, you expect the discounted one to be of worse quality. And more interestingly, as a consequence of that, it actually becomes less effective. Your physiology is less able to use it, and you end up being sicker for longer. Keeping options open. So we have this tendency, this over-tendency, not to want to have options closed. We want to keep them open, even if it's very costly. So imagine that there's a guy, and he's starting to date 3 women. And one of them looks like the more promising. So he really should stick with her. But the other 2 will not hang around. They will not be there in case the first relationship goes awry. So what does the person do? he tries to juggle all three relationships. He tries to date a little bit this one, a little bit this one, and more this one. But the fact that the other relationships are threatening to go away means that he is tempted to keep them alive, and by doing so he's taking attention away from the main relationship and redirecting it into something that is unlikely to yield any positive outcome. The hope of self-control mechanisms is that we can force ourselves to behave better in the future. So imagine your doctor schedule a colonoscopy for you. You will not wake up in 3 months' time and feel today is a good day for colonoscopy. So what can you do? If the doctor, when they schedule your appointment, asks you to give them $500 to be cashed only if you don't show up on time to the colonoscopy, what will happen now? Now when you wake up on the date of the exam, you will still not feel like a colonoscopy, but you would really not want to give up your $500. And as a consequence, you'll be much more likely to go. And that's the basic idea of a self-control mechanism, a mechanism that we implement when we have good intention that force us to behave well when the time comes. So it turns out that we live in a social market and we live in the financial market, and sometimes those things mix. And when they mix, the outcome is not always obvious. So if I ask you to help me in some mundane task, and I just ask it as a favor, you're very likely to help me. What if I offered you money? What if I offered you a little bit of money? $1, $2, $5? Would you tell yourself that you're happy to help me even more now that you get the benefit of helping me plus money? No, that's not what the results show. What the results show is that once you offer money, people reframe the task differently. They don't think about social favors anymore, they think about money. And if it's not a lot of money, they would often say no thank you and go away. And this is why sometimes paying people to do things can actually be a bad way to motivate them. One perspective on behavioral economics is that it's actually a sad view of human nature. We are fallible, myopic, emotional, and so on and so forth. That's one perspective. But there's also the hope. There's the hope of the self-control mechanisms, and there's the hope that if we understand where we fail, where we make mistakes, we might be able to think about mechanisms, self-improvements, we can think about policies, and all kinds of things that would ultimately lead us to lead a better life.